We are glad to have with us today Matt Fertura from Simio Cloud, John Ernst from Audience First Media, both more companies, here to talk about this new and challenging environment and what you can do to stay on top of it, bring new donors into your programs. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I am Matt Fertura, Chief Strategy Officer of Simio Cloud. And joining me is John Ernst. John, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm John Ernst, President of Audience First Media, part of the More Group. So thrilled you guys are joining us today, and hopefully you can use chat as we go through on questions. Would love to have an interaction, but like I said, it's been a challenging environment, and we want to put forth some ideas and discussion to sort of help you continually improve your program.
Yeah. Thanks, John. So as we all know, the calendar year 2022 so far has proven to be incredibly challenging for new donor acquisition across channels, but specifically so in direct mail due to a number of factors. Obviously we've seen the slackening of the COVID bump, which we rode the wave of, but of course we're now seeing that coming to an end. And of course that happens at the worst possible time, right? With costs increasing due to an inflation rate we've not seen in decades. So the result, of course, as you're all seeing, is a pretty detrimental impact to our programs. So what we plan to do today, John and I, is just to bring forth some strategies, some ideas that we've seen implemented over the years that we think would be really beneficial to your programs. And on the screen, you see in front of you, it's a laundry list of what we plan to discuss. So we're going to get through, we should get through most of it. But again, as John said, as we walk through each item, please feel free to stop and ask questions.
So I'll kick it off with a little bit of a perspective. And I know in the economy with inflation peaking here in June and still continuing, if you saw the economic reports today, that it's still coming down, but still pretty high, of just the impact on certain generations. And we know with some analysis that we've done that definitely the lower incomes and the older fixed income groups have been hit hard by disposable income in those cohorts. But just we took a step back and just said, what are the US populations and trending? And then we're going to take a look at some of the investment of donor volumes and others. So if you back up, Matt. So just to give some perspective, a lot of chatter about the baby boomers. So those really have been the cohort that are really carrying a lot of the direct mail universes. But on a lot of the studies that we've done, we're finding that 15 to 20% of most of the nonprofit direct mail acquisition is actually in that older 80+ group. So that's definitely been pinched by the economy, but the also sort of morbid fact of that group with that high percentage of direct mail invested there, about 13.5 of the 85+ population passes away each year. And that doesn't look at assisted living movement or others. So as you're looking at your investment strategies of just understanding that, what's the degree that you're investing in new donors coming in? Of course, a caveat that certainly if you have donors of that age group, they're prime for planned giving and bequeath gifts, but that's certainly an area that to cultivate and make sure that you can get those high gifts. But I think as far as bringing them onto the file, very limited time from an LTV perspective that you're able to keep them on file. So just taking a look at the investment there. And by the same token, a lot of talk about how big the millennials are, but there's also a very large bubble of the Gen X group. And that, as we've done the analysis, only about 10 to 20% of the acquisition volume is invested in those cohorts. So really understanding of how to balance that out. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the performance impacts and how to bring more of those into your program. So this is a case study, not atypical, that we've seen with a number of clients. Really looking at that volume investment, you can see that's the blue bars on the left chart against the revenue generated from those same cohorts. So that is in the orange. And you can see they're not all created equal. So again, that heavy mail-in volume for this particular client, 22% of their mail volume was invested in that 81+, and only about 17% of the revenue is generated from that. So pretty wide gap. And you can see as you dip down a little bit, the prime audiences is that 61 to 80, where you see a much greater revenue return from the mail volume investment. And as you move down, actually that 51 to 60 and even the 41 to 50 is not that far off, that there's a little bit closer gap, that they're a little bit underneath, but there's still reasonable return from those cohorts. But again, the key there is how much of the volume is skewed older. So we talked a lot about how the donor market has aged, but it's really accelerating. And I think with the onset of a lot of model development and list selects, that it is a little bit of you are what you eat. So if you're not changing the tactics of how you're building models and what type of audiences you're looking at, it is going to skew older. So we've spent an awful lot of time of understanding that if we want to drive more 51 to 60 cohorts into the direct mail, you can't keep doing what you're doing on the same select. So we've looked at those audiences and modeled very different, looking at specific, and obviously worked with the creative and agency partner to understand that there could be some creative and messaging and then some channel analysis that has to happen. But if you're just continuing status quo, this is probably what your acquisition portfolio is going to look like if you don't change course. Another area where I mentioned it is a different channel component as well. This is another case study we've done where we've looked at matchback of looking at a direct mail file and then understanding who might have given online anonymously within the next 30 days around that mail date. And I think most people have quoted that's in about 10 to 12% overall of direct mail is driving about 10 to 12% of donors that actually give online. But that percentage is not equal across the different cohorts. So as mentioned, we looked at some of those 40 to 60 cohorts that haven't maybe performed at or a little bit below from that investment of volume to revenue return. When you look at it from an attribution standpoint, you can see on the left, if you just looked at it strictly from a direct mail, you say, oh, well, of course, we're doing the right thing. Our direct mail is heavily invested in that 60 plus. Those are our best performing cohorts. When we added on that attribution from online, you can see the orange bars being added, that a lot of those 50 to 69 cohorts and even the 40 to 49 cohorts really become much more competitive and level the playing field with a lot of those older boomer groups that are continuing to carry the direct mail. So really trying to understand that there might be unseen performance. And then those are also tactics that you're going to need, that those are the type of donors as far as a model development that are going to be critical to identifying new audiences that you can mail into that are going to be much more productive and potentially help divest from some of those 80, 85 plus mail volumes that might not be as productive from an LTV standpoint.
Yeah, and then naturally, one of the other benefits is the fact that, of course, these folks are younger. So as opposed to the 85 plus cohort that John showed a moment or two ago, in theory, you will have much more time to cultivate these folks, which in theory should lead to a stronger LTV down the road.
And this is something, we've had a number of clients that have moved to some suppression, maybe not at 80 plus, but it's certainly at like 90 plus of just trying to divest some of that volume where it might be riskier to keep them on the file, might not be as productive. And then really implementing that matchback on a quarterly, if not monthly basis, just to really understand what the lists are driving and to make sure that that attribution is being pursued. And then that's really informing a lot of the multi-channel strategies that we'll talk about as we go through.
And related to attribution is, in this scenario, the specific tactic of co-targeting. And we've begun to see a significant amount of clients that are basically conducting a second appeal, typically through an online channel, to sort of boost the direct mail. I'd say probably close to half of the clients we're working with now have begun to dabble or effectively roll out with a co-targeting strategy. In a particular scenario in front of you, this is one client for whom the Simeo provided cold prospect direct mail audience was co-targeted in CTV, and the subsequent boost was a 2.5% lift to response rate. But what we do tend to see more often than not is a real strong lift to the average gift. In this case, it increased by $8, lowering the net CTA by almost $6. So it's one thing that we are really strongly proposing these days. The one caveat is, of course, you need approval from your third-party list sources. And Simeo certainly approves it. In my experience, most of the co-ops will as well, maybe for a nominal fee. I do foresee a point in the future where it's to the entire industry's benefit. And it's not difficult to foresee all traditional list owners allowing for this in the future. Again, I really think it's to everyone's benefit. And it's a stance that we're taking, that we do believe list owners should allow for this secondary appeal.
And we have a question from the audience. Do the LTV numbers that you're looking at in some of these take into account plan gifts that nonprofits receive, or are those considered separate?
So the revenue numbers I looked at from the age cohorts are acquisition volumes. So they are just sort of that, initial donations. So those would not take into account wills and estates. So that would definitely be something that you want to look at on a renewal. And again, just to that caveat to say, not advocating to stop mailing those cohorts when they're on your file. Is just the question of what's the cost to acquire bringing them on if they may not have a long time to pay back from an LTV perspective. But no, those do not include wills or estate revenues.
Thanks, John.
So one topic that we've really been shining a spotlight on, not only this year, but really going back the last couple of years, is this concept of truly maximizing all of the house data that our clients have at their disposal. And the best example, I think, is lapsed, right? So it's not uncommon for lapsed donors to be selected via some combination of RFM and, having one or two third-party models applied to them. But unfortunately, it's not uncommon for large segments of a client's lapsed population to be ignored, right? Maybe they're deeply lapsed. They last gave to that charity, 10 years ago and beyond. And yes, using RFM, you're never going to qualify somebody who last gave to you that long ago. But our proposition is that none of these audiences should be ignored, especially when overall response rates are as down as much as they are this year. And our general stance is you shouldn't limit the modeling to a single vendor. And over the years, I've seen this many times where co-op X will qualify 30% of a lapsed population, and then co-op Y will get a second pass at that same population, and maybe they'll identify another 10 or 15%. Just because everybody's data sets are unique, everybody's approaches are unique. So we strongly advocate, as we say here in quotes, leave no stone unturned. And I'm not limiting this to deeply lapsed, even like lower dollar populations that you're probably thinking, gee, why would I want to reactivate a low dollar donor? And that's true on the surface. They may be a low dollar donor to you, but we can see within a co-op that they're actually giving higher dollar donations elsewhere. And again, that's not going to be the bulk of that population. More likely than not, if they're giving you low dollar amounts, they're probably giving low dollar amounts elsewhere, but that's not a universal fact. So our proposition is that let models make that determination. And again, don't limit it to anything. So we're talking lapsed, but also warm prospects. Any individual who's raised their hand and facilitated a relationship with your organization should not be ignored. Whether they've just filled out a survey or they've made some sort of interaction online. If you have a collection of email addresses but no postal addresses, you can use a third-party data source, conduct a reverse append, get a postal address for a direct mail solicitation, etc. So we just can't stress enough, particularly when the going gets tough, if you will, that you really need to exhaust all of your data assets.
Another question from the group just to ask to say, is it okay that our deep lapsed reactivation campaign is slightly negative ROI? Candidly, it's just where does the acquisition and then the house file, blur the line. So I think the philosophy is, to Matt's point, leave no stone unturned. But again, if you can find a segment either straight or more likely through modeling of leveraging co-ops, and again, big or other modeling vendors to say, I think we're big proponents that no one model is going to solve it. So we're big proponents of multiple models with different perspectives and data. But again, if that deeply lapsed segment, even if it's a negative ROI, if it's better than the worst list in an acquisition campaign, that's a smart move. And I think that's the goal of, particularly in this environment, to help save costs. If you can pay a lower, there are some fees to modeling, but they're generally significantly lower and more efficient than having to go out and rent or even exchange lists on the market, and ideally have that better ROI to what might be the bottom 10% of a acquisition cold list mail plan.
This tactic is what we call a contactor saturation analysis. And really the goal is to determine in summary exactly how many times a prospect can be promoted to within a given period of time before their response, quote unquote, drops off a cliff. And what it does is it allows you to employ techniques to stem response degradation. And there's an awful lot of data on the screen in front of you, but the chart on the left is an actual analysis for a client. And what we did here is we took all of their direct mail acquisition promotions that occurred over a 12-month period, and we simply measured response rate based on the number of times each individual received a single promo from that organization. And you can see that there were people who received one piece of mail over a year, all the way down to 24. And all the way on the right, you'll see the response index. You see the first 4 are black, and then everything else is in the red. So literally upon the 5th time a prospect received a promotion for this particular client during this time period, you could expect their response rate to be below the overall average of all these mailings. And if you look at the column on the right, it's pretty linear, you know, a 93 index to an 86 to a 77, basically straight down. So this is a simple analysis which basically reveals exactly what the point of diminishing returns is. Now, ideally, the best way to use this would be not as a blunt tool to just cut volume, but as a means by which you can sort of guide new strategies. And in a perfect world, the client will have multiple controls where maybe Joe Smith receives a certain package 3 consecutive times. On the 4th promotion, if he's in the 4th campaign, he receives something different. Another tactic could be to simply rest Joe Smith for that 5th mailing, give him some period of rest so he's not as fatigued as he would be otherwise. Another tactic is to identify really the worst of the worst. In this particular scenario, you see people who received 10 or more promotions was about 782,000 pieces of mail sent over the year. Could some of that volume be cut and be replaced by something else, such as some of the lapse volume that we were talking about on the last slide? I think the one caveat to this is we have seen clients who maintain a rolling chronic non-response file, which inadvertently isn't rolling. It just continues to be added to. And that's something you don't want to do, because then you're just effectively shrinking your pool of prospects. So if the ideal way to maintain it would be every month people join that population, but other folks fall off of it because they haven't been promoted X number of times over a year. So again, it's really something that we've seen clients employ to stem response degradation, but the best way to do it is really to devise some package rotation strategies specifically.
Yeah, and again, we've leveraged this quite a bit in partnership with Matt and his team of just from a marginal list or average. Again, sometimes your best list can withhold. It might be the really, really high contacts that get scrubbed out. And it can also be on those marginal lists that you can tighten that up. So it's a little bit not, looking at a little bit more of a scalpel than a blood instrument. And I can attest to some of the creative rotation opportunities that we've seen, a fair amount of saturation, but even a lot of those control packages that might not have one up front, we're finding some success on retesting to say, if you look at it through that lens of, 3rd or 4th contact, that might be a much better option. So it's again, that as you're looking at your testing strategies from a creative standpoint, think in terms of how many times some people have seen that package, because even a package that might not have one might have a fair shot if it's an alternate look to what's happening from a package saturation. And we did a lunch and learn a couple months ago, and it seemed to be a lot of the organizations that had multiple packages, like a rotation strategy in place, seemed to be faring the economy much better than those that had a static control that was the same package that has been mailed in acquisition time and time again. A couple more questions. Thoughts on using a contact strategy if a mailer only mails 4 times a year? I'll take a stab and let Matt weigh in. That I think it's still worthwhile to look at that, but obviously a monthly mailer, or if somebody's got multis follow-up as well, that you have a much higher degree of saturation. So I'm guessing it's going to be less pressing on a quarterly, but I don't think it's without merit to understand that it might be worth a look at someone 4 times a year. It's the same type of analysis, but again, that one, it's a little bit less pressure.
Yeah, agreed. It's less likely to be a need, but we would let the data drive the decision. And to John's point, even with clients who do conduct monthly acquisition, we have seen analyses like this where the point of diminishing returns, as opposed to this scenario where response drops below average at 5 promos, it may be down to 17 or 18 promos before it turns negative. And more often than not, it is with the type of client that John just described, where there's 3, 4, even 5 controls, which just naturally stems fatigue. So we would let the data drive it. That's probably less likely for somebody quarterly than it is for somebody monthly, but it's certainly worth looking at.
Yeah, so I think we answered the other question, was just if someone says, does the time frame matter, month to month or every other month? So yes, definitely. The tighter the cadence of mailings, probably the more impactful it's going to be. And I think that's the other dimension that maybe isn't reflected in here, that Matt and others will look at, is just that resting period to say, did they receive 3 promotions 3 months in a row, or was it 3 promotions over 6 months? So there's some dimensions there just to understand of where you need to get that resting, or where you see that cutoff period. So there's multiple dimensions to this, but I think in general this is a theme that we see, that you get to a certain point of diminishing returns where just the same package over and over is not going to be a quality look, even on some of your best list sources.
Okay. So this oddly titled slide is another form of optimization that we've really seen take off over the last couple of years. And really the premise is fairly simple. The idea is to identify prospects before you mail them who third-party data suggests are habitual low-dollar donors. And of course, the idea is you don't mail them, you save the mailing cost of acquisition. But of course, with the idea being that you're never going to recoup the investment if you were to acquire them. So it's called low value scrubbing, literally to scrub low value prospects out of a merge purge mail file, again, before they're mailed. And the data in this particular scenario, we ranked at roughly 1.9 million records that a client did mail in their January 22 direct mail acquisition based on the value cohorts that we identified within Simio. And you can see right at the very top, the folks with a sub $15 designation was about 11% of the records mailed. And fairly all the way to the right, the RR index, response rate index. Sure, they responded at a really high rate, 56% above the average of the campaign. But look to the right, their average gift was $22, which was less than half of what the overall campaign generated. So one possible tactic would be to identify these, 220,000 folks in the merge purge process and drop them, not mail them, with the idea being, yeah, sure, they're highly responsive, but are we ever going to recoup the investment of acquisition, knowing that their average gift is so low and knowing how highly correlated inception gift is with subsequent LTV? Now, again, we're not necessarily saying, again, to use a blunt technique. We've seen other clients take this exact same type of data. And in the scenario with these 221,000 low dollar records, and this is going to sound, it's the complete opposite of what I'm suggesting with dropping them. They're actually mailing an ask string with the ladder that starts even lower than the control, with the idea being they're going to maximize response rate to an even higher degree, with the idea being that they might even make a profit with these people in acquisition. But that's an anomaly. That's more, it's rare. It's not common that happens. But again, every program is different. So we can conduct an analysis to show you over a course of a couple of mailings exactly how your prospects distribute. And again, the technique could be to drop them, save the mail cost, and of course, not suffer what's going to be a lack of return on investment, or just employ different techniques to really maximize this type of population.
This can also be very effective from a package placement of just like, especially if you have a premium or non-premium approach as far as how you can gear and maximize that response, particularly on some of the lower dollar segments, and trying to make them more productive. And again, the goal there is trying to lower the cost to acquire as much as you can as you go into the lower dollar average gift pools.
So this technique is tried and true, not necessarily anything new. Simple merge purge optimization. So the idea is you take, so it's a similar form of optimization to what we just saw, but instead of focusing specifically on low value prospects, you could have your co-op partners or any third party model or build a model to achieve a specific objective in acquisition. More often than not, it's a combination of response and gift, which is driving a revenue figure. And the idea is you rank every single prospect in your merge purge. And again, you drop those at the bottom of the model scores who are the least likely to perform. In this particular scenario, a client mailed about 1 million records. We built an optimization model, ranked everybody. The client wanted to mail small populations of the lowest scoring quote unquote prospects for a live in the mail read. And that's what you see here, roughly 10,000 from each. On the far right, the overall campaign, the cost to acquire was $27. The records that we ranked in the lowest score, 20, it cost almost $99 to acquire that population because the response rate was so low. And the next worst segment, right above that, score 19. They're better, sure, but they're still twice as bad as the overall average. It's costing $53 to acquire the donors, or to acquire these donors that we rank fairly low in the model. So again, it's a cost-saving technique. Again, the idea is to identify the quote-unquote worst likely performers within a merge output and drop and save the mail cost. And again, these are prospects who are, as you can see by the response rates, they're just not really aligned with this particular organization's mission. If you think about direct mail as well, the most responsive campaign is going to be, if you're lucky, 2% response rate, which still means 98% of these highly selected, highly targeted prospects you're selecting are not responding. So really, it's just a tactical way to quote unquote cut the fat and save costs.
Yeah, I'd say this is probably one of the #1 go-tos from the standpoint of those that are trying to battle an increase in production or postal, where you just, you can't maintain the same mail volumes because you just can't afford it. To help blunt some of those costs, instead of saying I'm going to bring in fewer cold names or outside names from prospecting, think in terms of like, maybe I should just optimize what's coming in, as Matt mentioned, because there's still good names on those. So even the worst list might be better than the bottom 10% that a co-op like Simio Cloud can really identify at the bottom that are going to be really, really unproductive. So this has been probably one of the top effective ways to help trim a little bit of cost without impacting that you still got to bring in quality new donors.
This is another topic that's been really top of mind over the last year specifically. It's something we're just simply calling a suppression file audit. And I guess we always ask the question of clients, do you know exactly what you are suppressing in a merge purge? Or do you know exactly what you're handing off to your co-op partners to use as suppressions when they're fulfilling prospect selections for you? We find more often than not that most organizations don't know. And it's not necessarily through anybody's fault. It's just that the business rules were put into place many, many years ago. Of course, there's turnover, and the current team, they simply don't know what rules were used to build suppression files. And we've seen scenarios where clients are suppressing like literally, millions and millions of records without truly knowing what that very large suppression file consists of. And it's especially troubling when if you look at a merge purge report and you realize that your top cold list and your top co-op segments are bringing in a significant number of prospects that are dropping to a suppression. So obviously, if a model is identifying a prospect, he's highly targeted, yet they're being dropped, and we don't necessarily always know why. So we strongly suggest to every client to conduct an audit of what they're suppressing. And we know it's not necessarily the easiest thing, but there's a lot of benefit to be had in truly knowing what you're dropping. And after having these conversations with clients, we have seen clients who have subsequently relaxed their suppression rules. and more names that they're buying from third-party sources are now flowing through merges. And again, if you think about it too, if a prospect is coming into a merge on 3 different sources, 2 co-ops, one of your best list sources, he really can't be more qualified than that. So you really want to maximize that prospect if you can.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, it's sort of that classic set it and forget it mode. I wish we were in live here, that people could raise their hand. Like, when's the last time you really just rolled up your sleeves and dug into it? I know it's messy and it can be a little tedious, but like really understanding of what are things that you're not mailing. It's just like who you taking out of the mail that are very viable, including that, we did an audit. We actually encourage doing this like every year, but like we did an audit for a client where it was, some of the do not mail stuff had been on the file for like 10+ years. So just understanding of if, how long has it been since somebody said, don't mail me, like a lot could have changed. And what's the right window? Is it, if you're past 3 years, chances are, and it's qualified somewhere else, chances are maybe they want to hear from you on that. So I think it's an understanding like how long do you need to turn names off. And we find a lot of waste in those suppression files. Even if you don't try to mail them as a standalone, at least don't suppress them from a qualified source as it comes in, as Matt was alluding to.
And on the same topic, we've also found that there's not always consistency with what is being suppressed in a merge purge and the suppression files that are handed off to co-ops for fulfillment, where co-ops might be given 4 million records to suppress, yet only 3 million are actually brought into the merge as a suppression. So it's really critical that there's alignment between what's handed off to third parties and what's in a merge, because there could really be a significant amount of valuable prospects that a co-op could be bringing to your program, but isn't, just because they have a suppression which says we shouldn't be providing them. So, it might seem, elementary, but we find this to be a really critical thing. That's when a client is able to conduct an audit and understand the business rules and ideally relax them, they're reaping a lot of benefit of doing that. And here we have a line item of some additional tactics or techniques that we are advocates of. So the first, again, not necessarily anything new, but I think particularly now when response rates overall are down and you need to do whatever you can to maximize performance, again, leave no stone unturned. So for example, if you are a client who does have multiple controls in acquisition, at the very least, you should be asking all of your vendors, co-op vendors, their thoughts on developing package or audience specific models. Typically, like a calendar as an example, almost always requires its own model compared to any other type of package. It's absolutely worth reinvestigating the topic, even if you had the conversation with your partners last year. And, also not only at the package level, but also at the audience level, as John showed us earlier, is there a benefit, and we think there is, of specifically appealing to younger audiences. So if you think about the way most models are built, most are built on previous promotions and those who responded, i.e. previous mail files, right? Which most likely are catering towards an older audience, but it's probably worth the conversation with your co-op partners to say, hey, can we investigate building models that are specifically looking at younger people, especially if you're going to conduct a co-targeting campaign, right? Because as the data shows, it's the 50 to 65-year-old who's more likely than the older audience, of course, to make that gift online. So, should we expand audiences when and where we can, particularly if it's a multi-channel appeal? We really think that's highly beneficial. Another technique is what we call modeled reuses. And if you think about it, the thing here is, if a co-op or a third-party list is one of your best performers, and it continues to be or proves to be over time one of your best performers, it's obviously bringing in a very qualified population. So how about applying a model to that population and trimming off the best of the best and mailing them a follow-up package? So, the theory is Joe Smith comes into a merge every single month. By definition, it means he's really, really highly qualified. Maybe as opposed to the folks who can't absorb a lot of promotions within a period of time, Joe Smith can. So you apply a model to a prior merge, And at the list level, pick, the top 10%, top 15%, et cetera. Now you have to be sure to get approval from each list owner, of course, but more often than not, you will receive an approval. So we've seen this tactic work pretty well. And then at the very bottom, response-centric modeled audiences. So this is really the converse of the low dollar scrubbing I referenced earlier. And I think it really depends on each program. There are some programs that really can't absorb this type of technique. But what it boils down to is if you conduct an analysis which shows that a lower dollar population is highly responsive, potentially profitable in acquisition, of course, you want to find more of this group. Most modelers are typically default to maximizing value, i.e. average gift. So this type of group tends to get ignored. And if they're ignored, that means they're not as inundated as everybody else, which in theory means they might be even more likely to respond today than they would have been a year ago, since they simply receive less promos than higher dollar populations. So again, it's something to consider, not necessarily appropriate for every program, but it's certainly a question I would ask of my co-op partners.
Yeah, and I think that's something we've really adhered to at Audience First, of understanding that it's a portfolio approach. And I think there's a lot of mailers that had models that were very focused on what we call value, or trying to maximize LTV and the higher average gift. And they didn't have enough of a suite of models that were a little bit, maybe it's not completely response focused, but response even with a gift floor, to understand that there's a mix on performance. So when the economy softened and we've seen response rates go down, they're very exposed on some of those that might be great value, but at a smaller response rate, a 10% drop in response hits a lower responding list a lot harder than one that might be higher response. So it's definitely making sure that you have enough of both types of models, response-oriented and gift-oriented models in the mix, even though that the portfolio might be mail-in more than others. But again, when you do see a downturn, that you have that ability and you've got data and models established that you've tried and true and tested, that if I need to expand some volume into those response-oriented in a downturn to help bring the donor counts in, that you have that flexibility to do it. So that's something just to think about as you're moving forward, to making sure that you have both types of models in the mix, even though you might mail the value ones more to a degree from an LTV perspective.
Yeah, and on that point, we're not necessarily advocating, just bring them in and then, what we're suggesting is with that particular tactic, you'd almost certainly need to employ a different or unique renewal strategy. So instead of receiving 12 or 14 renewal pieces over some period of time, maybe this group can only absorb 3 or 4, right? So again, it's not a one size fits all. As really none of these tactics or ideas are one size fits all. And I think the word John mentioned a minute ago is portfolio, and that's sort of how we view it, that any acquisition program should really have a quote unquote portfolio of models, of techniques, of course, of packages. Again, I'm probably stating the obvious, but what we have found, and John mentioned this earlier, is that the clients who have a little more diversity in everything they do, so not only in package and in creative, but in audiences that they're promoting to, and how they're devising these audiences, et cetera, are generally, weathering the storm a little bit better than some who don't have those advantages.
I think that's about it. So we can pause if there's any more questions from the field. We can open that up, or if not, we certainly thank you for your time and attention, and certainly are welcome. You've got our emails and contact, so feel free to contact Matt or myself if there's any follow-up questions, or if you want to talk about any of these concepts further.
As folks are typing questions in, wanted to ask, you mentioned this type of portfolio strategy and the variety of packages that folks should have. Can you talk a little bit about package-specific modeling, whether premium, non-premium, or down into the specific type of package, and how that would work for a client?
Yeah, well, I mean, the concept is pretty straightforward. I think so here's the scenario. So one client we work with, they have a non-premium control, which is mailed in every campaign during the year, 12 times a year. And then throughout the year, they have what they call seasonal packages, which is a combination of more premium-based, highly incentivized type promotions, wrapping paper, gift cards, calendars. and I think I made the point earlier, typically there tends to be a difference in the type of donor that a highly promotional package appeals to versus a mission-driven, non-incentivized appeal. So I think our standard recommendation is, when you're working with any co-op partner or anybody's developing models, is to have those different data sets analyzed to determine if there's in fact a need for package specific models. It's not always the case. Obviously the one thing that attracts an individual is the organization itself, right? At least in my opinion, the appeal or the creative is secondary in nature, but it's certainly a critical component. So, there are scenarios where we have, 4 to 5 different models that are developed for a specific client for their acquisition, one for one package type, another for another package type. And then there are clients for whom we do the analysis and it's determined that, there's 5 controls, but there's only a need for, let's say, a non-freemium model and then a freemium model. So again, it's not a one size fits all. It's let the data sort of drive exactly what the strategy should be, but there should be the investigative work done for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's a fair amount of analysis if you've got package specific models, because my experience is that a lot of times you might see across the board the model does a good job of differentiating audiences, but a lot of times the top segments there's a fair amount of crossover. So we've seen that it might be the same audience in the top tiers that would benefit from that rotation, and then the package specific models enable you to go a little bit deeper. So whether that's seasonal rotations or not, it could be an effective strategy. But there's usually a lot of analysis underneath just to see what's kind of the crossover, how similar are the audiences that result from the model. I know there's another email or another note just saying, when you have several control packages, do you recommend mailing one package type per campaign, or better to mail 2 to 3 co-control packages and split audiences? Again, I think that depends on that crossover, like how similar are the models or list selections to each package. And they might benefit from, if you have that sort of built-in rotation, that the audiences are very similar, it might be wise to have that rotation strategy that I'm going to mail 1 per campaign, particularly to get the economies of scale from a production standpoint. So I think that's ideal, but I think you just need to understand how different are the audiences geared towards those controls of how much you want to leverage them. Because I think if you've got 2 or 3 different controls that have very different audiences, I think the more that you can be in the mail to capture recency with, and that speed of data that is going to drive response, that's better.
And also note, so not only building, unique models at the package level, but there is for some clients, seasonality is in fact, of course, the thing, right? So, I've seen where, we've developed holiday season models because during that period of time for particular clients, typically November, December, they do cast a wider net than they do in other times of the year. So it attracts, more diverse audience. So really, again, it's the whole concept, or the theme really is, leave no stone unturned. Don't just take for granted that someone who's responding in July is the same as someone who would respond in November. Let the data make that decision for you. But, we are proponents of, again, maximizing audiences in every conceivable way.
Okay, those look like the questions that we had. So thank you very much for your time today. This recording will go up on YouTube for future reference. Will also be available on the More website. And if you have any questions as you come up, feel free to email Matt or John for more information. Anything else you gentlemen would like to say?
No, just so we thank you for your time. We're happy to host this today. And again, please reach out. We're always available.
No, appreciate you all. Appreciate the sharing of ideas, and good luck as we go into the fall season. So fingers crossed that we see response rates recover, and we have a strong fundraising and stable fundraising end of the year here.